Welcome to AES Melbourne. My name's Graham Huon. Tonight we are privileged to receive a presentation from David Hudson. Where's David? There he is, front and centre on mine. On the heart of the recording studio, the heart that indeed founded the modern industry. David Hudson will describe restoring and format converting two professional Studer A80 Mark IV multi-track tape recorders, taking the story from their acquisition to redeployment as deserved and actively used museum pieces. David will also provide interesting insights into previous owners and uses of the A80 machines and associated mixing desks. For anyone involved in the audio industry, technology, or equipment restoration, this will be a valuable story and a useful resource. David's career started many years ago, not too many. It spans more than 50 years, and he's been with telecom carriers, multinational vendors, recording studios, IT and consulting, and in audio, video, digital migration. Quite a breadth of experience. David graduated from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, with first-class applied science degree in electrical engineering. Am I allowed to mention the date?
Sure.
1973, and has an MBA with distinction from the Southern Cross University, Australia in 1994. In the 1970s, David was with BC Tel as Radio Engineering Task Force member, planning the medium frequency and high frequency and cellular networks. At this time, David's musical interests enabled his Vancouver folk music group to perform in Vancouver and Los Angeles, recording singles including broadcasts on CBC radio and television. David joined the legendary Little Mountain Sound Studios in 1974 and helped build, maintain and operate this world-leading facility. A 1977 one-year world adventure trip took him past the homes of Studer and landed him in Sydney in 1978, where he joined the team rebuilding EMI Studio 301. David was then Facility Engineering Manager from 1979 to 1988. There are some interesting tales to be told from these times, but not tonight. Okay. David co-founded the AES Sydney Group in 1988 and co-authored the Journal of Acoustical Engineering Society V46 in 1/2/1998 article, The Growth of AES in Australia, sponsored by the late Neville Teal. David is presently AES Life member and AES Melbourne Section Committee member, which I am grateful for. David's interests in retirement include restoring vintage pro audio gear, as you're about to discover. Now, can you please temporarily unmute your microphones, get a bit of practice doing that, and could you please welcome David for tonight's very interesting and informative session. Thank you. And now can you remute, especially the dog. Thank you.
Wonderful.
David.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Graham, and welcome everyone from far and wide to this session. It warms my heart to see the number of people who have joined, so thank you one and all. To those attending live and also to those who will replay the recording of this Zoom session in future, which will be on the website. Thank you, Graham, again for that intro, to Peter for arranging the event and for taking care of all of the back office stuff with Paolo as well. So I think before I'll try to maintain eye contact, but I'll be checking my slides on the screen, the content on my slides. So you may not always see my direct line of sight, but I'll give it my best shot. And I'll try to keep the presentation moving along fairly briskly. The slides tend to be a bit dense, a bit lot of info, but I won't be reading them word by word, and it won't be death by PowerPoint. And I think what we'll do is have the slides are in two parts. First part is just a little bit about how I became involved in tape recording in my life and where that led me, and then we'll take a break, Q&A, kick back to camera. And then part B will be about the A80 and what happened in the restoration conversion and how they wound up at MONA. So that's the plot. Thought I'll just start off now by presenting this title page. Is that showing on everyone's screen? All good? Yes?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so away we go. The new life in a new century was Peter Smerdon's concept, and I think it fits really well. The main focus, of course, is the restoration of these two fine machines, and they found a new life in a new century down in Tassie, as we call it. The little shot there is when I was working on the machines partway through the project, along with the A810 beside it. So should be able to change the slide. First things first. So we'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of these lands and waters from which this presentation is given, and Indigenous elders past, present, and emerging. We're running the show from Mornington Peninsula in Victoria. Some of the mice type, fine print here. Studer is a brand and registered trademark of Evertz in Canada. I've put a URL there if you want to see what they're doing with Studer consoles and other audio products these days, including manufacturing in Canada. All trademarks and logos are the property of the respective owners and no claims are made, and any use of copyright or proprietary information is covered under fair dealing for AES education, research, and study purposes. All photos are credited as shown. I have no commercial interest in any supplier mentioned, and brickbats and bouquets and corrections are most welcome. So here's the track list, aka agenda, for the presentation. Like an LP, it has side A and side B. On the A side, a little bit of the history of how I got involved in tape recording. Then the end of side A, we'll do Q&A. And then side B is actually getting into the machines themselves and what happened to them and where they are now and what's happening in the future. The first part is really covering how I figured that a recording studio would be a good place to have a career with interest in both electronics and music, and how I worked for these two fine studios. The two machines in part B, there's a 1-inch machine that was a very special version of PAL video layback recorder. We'll talk about that later. The other machine is also a special version. It was a 1/2-inch 4-track for loop bin cassette mastering. So I can't believe I'm saying this, but more than 60 years ago, I was messing around with tape, and the first machine was this Voice of Music VM700, popular in schools, made in the 50s, just 2-head, 1/4-inch 1/2-track mono. Dad was an elementary school principal, and he used to bring it home on weekends, and I'd play around with it and get to know tape recording. And the tapes, yes, they still play. This is a Christmas Eve shot where we were having a lot of fun. I don't recall actually what the program was, but obviously people were enjoying the whole experience with the tape deck. Then here's a classic nerd shot. At 13, I went into this science fair with a photocell relay exhibit and in BC, and went on to Montreal, Canada-wide science fair. And that's pretty interesting experience as a young kid. Just a little footnote, that photocell in the upper corner of the left-hand picture is a Clarex CL603, which Studer chose for the tape end sensor and is on every A80. And there you go. There's another link back to my past. When I was 15, I got a ham license and set up a shack, as they say, VE7 BBC in Vancouver. And the gear was a national receiver and a Viking Valiant transmitter, had a tower, cubicle, 80-meter dipole, lots of fun with ham radio. The ham radio interest later led to my career in telecommunications with BCTEL and then with Alcatel in Australia and in Dallas. In the 70s, around 67, 68, started playing guitar with Gary Poole, and that led to the formation of the surnames Hudson Carr and Poole, the Hudson Carr Poole. We played around Vancouver folk clubs and theaters and things, and then we met Marilyn, and it became Marilyn Hudson Carr and Poole, and we did some singles and got on CBC TV and radio and had a lot of fun with music, just really for fun, not really serious about a career. I guess it was semi-pro. If you want to learn more about the music there and what we were up to and what Gary's currently doing, he's a very prolific songwriter. GaryPoolSongs.com is the link there. So, as I said earlier, for a kid who's interested in electronics and music, a recording studio was a pretty interesting place to wind up. And after graduating UBC, I joined Little Mountain, home of Griffiths Gibson Ramsey Productions, a jingle production firm with most clients in the US, large corporates. Griffiths Gibson hired more musicians than the next to the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra. So it was a really busy studio, fast production. You learn to do track laying, overdubbing, mixing, packaging the whole thing, and broadcast dubs pretty well in one day per jingle. We had 4 studios. 2 of them had Neve 8036 and the third had 8014. We had Scully tape decks, 2-inch 16 track with Dolby A, Scully 280Bs, and Olivia Newton-John recorded Don't Cry for Me, Argentina in the studio in the picture. Later, after I left, Aerosmith, Bon Jovi, AC/DC, a lot of talent wound up loving this, mainly Studio B at Little Mountain. Became quite famous. Little did I know, because I was in Australia back then. On this world trip that Graham mentioned, well, before that, actually, I met the late Bruno Hochstrasser in Vancouver at a broadcast engineering exhibition. Bruno was marketing Studer Canada, and cleverly he loaned the 16-track that he was launching in Vancouver to Little Mountain, and a year later they wound up buying a 24-track, which in the picture you can see we're installing in one of the Little Mountain studios in 1977. There I'm expanding the Neve patch bay to 24-track. So I decided to take a year off, see the world. After becoming a professional engineer, had the registration, off we go, take a year, come back, carry on. But little did I know what was in store for me when I got to Sydney. Bruno kindly arranged a factory visit at Regensdorf near Zurich in 77. And there's the little map of where Regensdorf is located. There's one of the main buildings of Studer, which has since been demolished, and that site has been redeveloped. Thanks to Martin Berner for the video of that HQ demolition. One interesting link here that everybody could have a look at. The late Bruno Hochstrasser presents the Studer legend, and he goes through what was then the Studer Museum, going through the history of the tape machines, including clips from Willie Studer and Ken Townsend at Abbey Road. And that YouTube clip is very, very interesting. There's a companion clip. Bruno takes us through the history of the consoles. Well worth having a look. So I landed in Sydney in 78, and within a week of arriving, after visiting all the studios, the word was out that EMI's rebuilding and they might need some help. So there were 7 studios on 2 levels at 301 Castlereagh, but we call it 301. And we put in new Neve 807.8s, 3 of them, one with NECAM 1. We had 17 Studer A80s. I won't read the list, but just about every flavor of A80, plus 824-track, 810, 822-track B67. We had the largest fleet of Studer machines next to the ABC in Australia, well supported by Clive, the late Clive Sloss, Robert Sloss, and the whole team at Syntec. Joined Amber after EMI, joined Amber in 88, and we were importing, distributing Otari, Nagra, Lyric, Mitsubishi, Prodigy, and so forth. So I got to know quite a few other brands than Studer, but today we'll just talk about the A80s. The picture in the top center is two 16-track master and slave linked up with timecode, plus a 24-track narrow body. So we had all kinds of A80 machines in at 301. I'm going to break now just for a sec. Stop share, see if people have any Q&A at this stage. Anything comes to mind? Happy to have a chat about that. Also, get away from my voice.
No, you've done well so far, David. Thanks.
So far, so good. Well, okay. Let's carry on. So here's the first slide on B-side of this album. Just a helicopter view of the A80s life cycle. Conceived in '66 and introduced to the market in 1970. So it really had a 19-year life cycle in 4 major upgrades, Mark 1 to Mark 4. And it's interesting to note the first multi-track A80, built on the 5th of December in 1970, was a 1-inch A-track. And that's exactly what is now down at Frying Pan Studios at MONA. A Mark 4, not a Mark 1. There's other broadcast versions. First 24-track A80 VU appeared in 1973. And in 1974, major technology change to Mark II was introduced. Won't go into those details unless you want to know. There's transportable versions, and then one with the German tape path, and then the Rundfunk Compact RC came out as well. The Mark III had significant improvements on the Mark II, narrower head block, inline erase head instead of 2 erase heads, and that meant faster punch-ins, also better control of the ramping of the bias and erase, much more flexible. It had other improvements, but the Mark III was a really popular machine and addressed some of the shortcomings of the previous models. The Mark IV came out with Dolby HX Pro, new record drivers in the audio channels, number of mechanical improvements, transformerless line in, transformerless line out. Really fine technology. And those are the machines that Mark IV is the last machine that Studer produced and is the technology of the 2 machines that I've restored. Studer also made special versions for cassette quality control with 0.15-inch tape at 1 7/8 inches per second. It's the only A80 that has preamps in the head block. And there's a trivia night for nerds answer. The A80 layback was introduced in January '85, and that's the 1-inch machine that I'll be talking about in a sec. The end of A80 production was in 1989, and by then Studer had made over 10,000 A80s of various formats, shapes, marks, flavors, special versions, and that means a number of things for people like me who are restoring. One of them is that there's still quite a good source of spare parts and knowledge, information, expertise on these fine machines. Not true for some other less popular models. So that was a big help in doing this conversion work. One of the reasons the A80 was so popular and famous was its mechanical stability, as well as its electronic reliability and easy to repair. In terms of the mechanical stability, here's a shot photo from the 25th year history booklet of Studer. And the way that Studer die-cast this aluminium or aluminum for some of our friends chassis meant that there are reference planes here that you can put gauges on to set correct roller heights, head heights, and so forth, spooling motor hub heights. And their factory, I think, had a machine that could measure down to about 1 micrometer. So they were super precise. And the famous attention to Swiss quality was evident throughout the machine. The first machine I'll talk about of the two is an A80 View. It's a 3-track, so -3, LB for layback. It's a 1-inch Mark IV, the last Mark manufactured, and the test report of the machine that I acquired is dated 1989, which is the last year of production. So it had all of the latest features. This is just a flyer. I don't expect people to be able to read the mice type here, but the flyer just gives you a photo of what the machine looked like. Track 1 and 2, left and right stereo on a videotape, and back then it was 1-inch Type C videotape that was very popular with broadcast and post-production. Track 3 on this machine was for timecode, so you could lock up this audio tape to other video machines, and the whole concept here was to lay back final stereo audio onto the videotape. And why would you want to do that on a Studer? Because you don't have to do it on an Ampex VPR3 that costs $200,000. Means you're not tying up your expensive full video decks in your production suite, post-production suite. So that's the concept. And because of the different formats of 1-inch video back then, Type B came first. It's a Bosch originated format. The oxide is on the outside of the supply reel, and the supply reel turns clockwise when it's unwinding, the opposite direction. So Studer made this 3-roller left-hand tension sensor, which you'll never see on any other machine. And it also had a B and a C switch. Now the C format was like regular audio tape with the oxide on the inside, and it turned counterclockwise when it was recording or playing. And it uses the normal 2 rollers on the left-hand tension sensor. The BC switch did 2 things. One, it put the phase shift capacitor of this supply motor in the other leg of the motor, so it turned the other way. And the second thing it did was a mechanical, very clever mechanical arrangement for the brake band, so that the differential brake force went the other way for the 2 different formats. I decided to leave that mechanism in place for the machines that went to MONA. It should stay in the C position, by the way. So that's the layback flyer. And what's the story? Since 1975, when I met Bruno at Little Mountain, I just lusted after owning an A80. And 40 years later, I was able to. Doron Kippen, in the picture at the top, is the owner of Music and Effects at South Yarra here in Melbourne. He bought this 1-inch layback machine new from Syntec, and he used it with an Editron synchronizer to do sweetened audio, final audio back onto videotape, and eventually that format became obsolete. The industry moved on, and Doron put a white sheet over it and put it in the back of his studio for decades, until I moved to Melbourne from Sydney and looked up Doron, visited his studio. He pulled the sheet off, and I fell in love with this machine. And I thought, what can I do with this? What can I do with this guy? It had only 686 hours on it. It was one of the highest serial numbers I've ever seen. But it's a challenge. The tape speed is 9.44 inches per second, or almost 24 centimeters per second. Really unusual heads. The PAL format heads are at the bottom picture. Erase, record, play. You can see the 2 tracks at the top, audio 1 and 2, and then right down at the bottom is the timecode track. So I realized that as it was, the machine had no purpose, had no application. I had to make it into something else. Doron actually kept all the ephemera, so I had the quotation, the purchase order, factory test report, and critically, Doron kept the Studer internal factory engineering documentation on how you take a standard 1-inch 8-track and make it into one of these special version layback machines. So I was able to refer to that document and reverse engineer all of the special modifications. So what am I going to do? Before MONA had the idea of building a studio, my first inkling was to, why not just do a super analog? And there is, believe it or not, a 1-inch 2-track super analog format. And of course, the wider the track, the better the signal to noise ratio. So that was an interesting option. The photo down below from John French at JRF shows the heads mounted on an A80 machine. And I thought, well, I could do that. I'm not running a studio. Who would buy it? If you're mastering, say, if you're doing lacquer mastering for, vintage LP production, who's going to have a pre-listen machine? You'd need to go digital, blah, blah, blah. But it sounded like fun. Or the other option was just 8-track classic, 1-inch 8-track format. So before MONA came up, I just decided probably 8-track would be more popular and sellable. I didn't think that I would be keeping the machine. As I say, I'm not running a studio. And the machine really deserved to go to somewhere where it would go back into service. So in 2021, MONA got interested in the 8-track format, and it was developing plans to complement 8-track, well, use the 8-track to complement a very rare 1956 EMI Red 17 console that came from Abbey Road Studios, which is now down at MONA. The console, by the way, is owned by my brother-in-law, Dave Roper, on this call, and supported by Barbara Martin, my wife's sister. So it was through really my brother-in-law and his relationship with Brian Ritchie at MONA that I got wind of this possibility of providing this 1-inch 8-track fully restored for their studio. Track formats. First of all, this is a Christmas card on the left of from Studer in 1985 that I kept because I thought it was very clever how they projected the year onto their beautiful heads that they made in-house at Regensdorf. 4 types of material over the life of the A80, from Vacadeur, Recovac, Hymu 800 to Vitrovac, the latest. I don't think the A80 actually used Vitrovac. That was used on the later machines, A20, 27, and so forth. Track formats here from Studer documentation. The green ticks are the 2 formats that I chose as the target format for the conversion. 2-track 1/2-inch has 5mm wide tracks, really nice fat tracks for good signal to noise. Popular format, probably the best stereo format going. 8-track 1-inch has 1.75mm wide tracks, same as 16-track 2-inch. So now we have some targets to aim for. So I started work on the 1-inch machine in August 2016, and 6 years later, just last November, delivered to MONA. So it was a labor of love over 6 years, off and on. Some years not much, more recently a lot of work. Now there's 2 parts to this story, one of restoration and conversion. One is the transport itself. So that's all the mechanical bits and pieces, the transport logic cards, power supplies, etc., that you can see in the bottom picture. And the other part is the audio side. And you could call it a complete rebuild, I guess, of the machine, down to bare metal. I had to take off the off-on switch of the layback machine because there's only one video speed. It's on or off. Rewired the supply motor cap connections so we don't have the reversing thing with the phase cap, and then changed tension rollers to the standard 2-roller left-hand side assembly. Direction sensors had to be restored because they were special for layback speed. Changed the badges, changed the capacitors with capacitors from Peter Money on the call from Nagravox. Hello, Peter. Replaced the layback Mark IV amplifiers with Mark IV amplifiers that I got from House of Blues Nashville through Mark Schwartzman at Retro Gear Shop. they were 1530 inches per second, which is another challenge I'll get to. Recapped all the cards, transport logic, audio, counter, timer cards, restored the counter to standard. There was this circuit here below the speed label is actually a divide by 23 card that was used for the layback machine because they had to work with 9.44 inches per second. So the capstan servo, instead of 800 hertz, was 1007 hertz. The timer roller had a unique diameter not found on any other machine, and so forth. So they had to do a lot of modification to record videotapes at that 9.44 speed. View meter bulbs. So I found BA7S style globe, which is a 50,000 hour LED, and warm white 24 volt, and no more changing burned out bulbs behind the VU meters, guys. They're available on eBay. The bearings I obtained from an eBay seller, Grega Pier in Slovenia. Thank you, Grega. They're Japanese bearings, and they all work really, really well. Replaced the video layback heads with standard 1.317 Studer heads that are new old stock. I managed to find unused heads, rare, and they perform perfectly. They went really well. Now I had to, of course, if you change the heads and the roller guides and bearings, you need to check the heights and the zenith and everything else of these bits and pieces and the mechanical side of things. And I couldn't find any guides in Australia, precision gauges in Australia. So I was able to borrow a set of gauges from Switzerland and from Alistair here in Sydney, and have a full set cloned locally in Melbourne to between 1 and 2 micrometer precision. So I have a set of gauges for 1/4 inch up to 2 inch for these machines and what may be future work. Converted and replaced the plugins. I had to drop the EQ from 1530 down to 7.515 for a reason I'll get to later. And then I found a remote control. It's hard to find an A80 remote control that hasn't been really abused in service. And this remote control is new. It's based on Raspberry Pi. It's made by Uffe Lund Hansen of Frostback Studios in Copenhagen. And that remote control, it does both transport and audio, works really well, and it has more features than the original Studer remote control. And then finally, of course, when all that work's done over the years, calibrate the transport, calibrate the audio, and make sure it sounds good, which is the most important thing. Okay, just a few photos, a bit of an album, collage of pictures of some of the work over the years. There's the two machines side by side, 1 inch and 1/2 inch in bits with reminders about do this and do that and change this and clean that. Here's at the top center is a power supply with the new Nagravox charge caps wired in. Below that is one of the spooling motors where I'm changing the bearings. Next over are the AC phase caps at the back of the chassis. And you can see the Gardner-Denver wire wrap pins on the transport logic edge connector cards that Studer used back then. Below the wire wrap photo, there's pictures of the circlip tools, bearings, the Kluber grease, very detailed work to change bearings, but not difficult. You just need to be patient. Below the circlips, you'll see an 8-track repro head that's got blue ink on it, and that's actually a whiteboard text marker, which we used to do at 301 to make sure the wrap of the head is correct and that the gap is in the center of the tape contact. So you can actually rotate the head on its mounting screw and make sure optically with a magnifier that the gap is centered. Next, over bottom center, 2.60 volts DC is the volts you need to come off the tension sensor pot on the right-hand side, left-hand side, as you start to calibrate the mechanical operation of the A80, including tensions and so forth. That's a critical step. The Mark IV has a buffer chip on a PC board under the pot, which improves operation of that tension sensing. Next, over to the left, you'll see a 1-inch, 25.35 millimeter precision gauge against the record head of the 1-inch 8-track head block. It's sitting on a 41.05 millimeter reference block and a granite surface plate. And there you optically make sure that the head is dead vertical, in other words, zenith. If you don't, you'll get a trapezoidal wear pattern on the head. Nobody wants that. Pictures of some of the borrowed gauges down in the far left corner, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch, 1 inch, very kindly loaned from Kali in Switzerland and Alistair in Sydney. So the second machine, we're looking at the A80 mastering recorder, MR. It's actually a modified A80 VU. In this case, the Mark II of the MR is really an A80 VU Mark IV with some mods. And in this case, the machine started life as a 4-track 1/2 inch machine. And its purpose was to record the loop bin master tape, 1/2 inch tape, or 1 inch. We had 1 inch at 301. And usually at 3 3/4 inches per second. Why 3 3/4 inches per second? Well, in cassette manufacturing rather, at the factory, you want to produce as many cassettes as you can in the shortest possible time at the lowest cost. So you guys probably know all this, but there's a high-speed loop bin which takes this master tape, and the operator splices the head to the tail, so it's a continuous loop. It's put in a horizontal bin. It's air blown so the tape doesn't get tangled, and they run the loop bin at 20 feet per second. So that's 240 inches per second. So the bias is 10 megahertz, and the audio is in the AM broadcast band. It's an amazing technology. The slaves that receive that playback signal are running at 10 feet per second, or 120 inches per second, because the cassette runs at 1 7/8, not 3 3/4. That's the 2-to-1 ratio. So high-speed cassette duping was a pretty interesting technology, and trying to get azimuth stability, phase stability at 3 3/4 with 1 inch tape was a real challenge. There was many through the nights trying to keep that system perfectly aligned. So the machine that I was able to acquire, next slide, was a 1/2 inch 4-track, and I found it at Greg Cameron's studio, Amandala Studio in Sydney, and I started work on that in 2019. So I had to do a number of mods, not quite as serious as the video layback, but it was 3 3/4, 7.5 speed range, not appropriate for pro studio mastering. So that had to change. Move and direction sensors had to be changed. Again, charge caps, phase shift caps. The 8-channel amplifier rack had to be dropped down to 2 channels. So I had to find a 2-channel rack somewhere. Really rare. I found 2 at Audio House in Switzerland. Rewired the head cables. One of the pictures, the picture below the power supply capacitors shows head cables and the head connectors pulled out. I had to remove the erase, record, repro cables of 6 of the 8 and just leave left and right tracks 1 and 2. And in addition, the repro head cable had to be totally replaced with the one in the picture below with the fat purple cables. These are low capacity repro head cables, which you need to do if you're recording, if you're converting the machine to a 1/2 inch 2-track, because the repro head has a much higher impedance than standard. Standard is 10 millihenry. In the case of 1/2 inch 2-track, it's 170 millihenry. And the repro preamp has to be converted for transformerless input. So there's no more a transformer facing the head. The head goes straight into electronics. Again, bearings, heads, guides. I had to convert all the EQ in the amplifiers from House of Blues Nashville down to 7.5, 15. The reason is I couldn't find two-pole capstan motors. Two-pole capstan motors are the ones that run at 15 and 30 inches per second. And because of the lack of the supply of those capstan motors, I settled on keeping the original four-pole motors, which run at 7.5, 15. And that all worked well. It just meant I had to find a dozen EQ for record, sync in the case of the 8-track, and repro. There's a photo down on the left here. These are the little LED, BA7S LED globes I used for the VU meter illumination. And there's an 089, Studer A80s console had an A80 remote control. And this is what I've used for the MONA remote control of the 2-track. Very simple transport control. So restoration, upper left corner. Here's the half-inch 2-track chassis, basically stripped out, cleaned, and rebuilt. Next photo over top center. Unfortunately, I ordered two channel amplifier racks out of Switzerland, and they arrived damaged due to mishandling by the carrier, and that caused a claim and everything. But eventually, I had them repaired by what we call here a panel beater or a metal shaper, and then I had to have them powder coated at an electronics assembly plant and so forth. But it all came good in the end. The photo here next is just of the 2-track, half-inch 2-track heads mounted on the head block. And the MR head block has ceramic guides for improved tape guidance. Middle photo is some equalizers showing how I had to repopulate the E96 series resistors on the equalizer plugin to convert various versions of EQ to 7.5, 15. And I wasn't going to show this, but here's the lab workshop home office in full flight with lots of stuff going on there, but that's where all the work happened. It serves me quite well. It's quite good. Here's some challenges. I mentioned the 1530 capstan motor non-availability. EQ plug-in cards I've talked about, the 2-channel amplifier racks I've talked about, half-inch 2-track erase head. It turns out that the erase head, I'll go back a slide, on the lower left-hand picture, there's a full-track half-inch erase head that I obtained from a very kind supplier in Switzerland. It turns out it's only for A80R and A81 and A80RC. It's 0.5, 0.6 millihenry. And it wouldn't resonate on the A80 VU's outputs, the erase output stage. So I had to find somewhere a half-inch 2-track erase head for A80 VU, and the only source was JRF selling a Flux Magnetics brand new erase head, which received in December and is now at MONA. Another challenge, up the top left picture, you can see the condition of the MR machine as received in 2019 and came out of Sydney. There's a bit of rust here and there. I found the paint matching, the RAL anthracite gray paint match, etc., and cleaned it all up. Redid the connectors, the Amphenol, hello Paolo, Amphenol connectors, cleaned it all up, power supply, made it look like new. Even found Bassett casters to replace these original rusted ones. These are pretty well unobtainium now. This particular caster thread isn't available, by the way. So look after them and don't break them off. Here in the center is the half-inch 2-track new Flux Magnetics head that goes into the half-inch 2-track. There's a cable greening issue I encountered, which I hadn't heard of before, but I guess you guys might have. Cable greening, I thought originally it was corrosion, maybe from Sydney salt air or something, which appeared on these Molex connectors. and not anywhere else, just on some Molex connectors, but only on some colors of PVC cable, the darker colors mainly. And I thought, what's going on here? And I looked it up, and the PVC plasticizer reacts with the copper and produces copper oxide and other stuff, which produces a conductive green goo. And I had to remove it with an ultrasonic cleaner with warm solvent, and it did the trick. But it was another challenge to overcome. Another challenge was finding these precision gauges, and here's the set of 5 gauges that I've had made. They're still encased in a protective material, but they've been really, really handy and absolutely essential if you're going to set the heads and guides properly. The other device Studer requires to do the tension sensing set up for mechanical adjustment is a tendilometer, and one of these I acquired through an acquisition of some mastering gear from a large Sydney studio. Remote controls, I've talked about Frostbox remote for the 8-track, and here's a picture you can see of the multicolored buttons. You can run the transport menu, you can run the audio menu, you can basically do any control you want of the A80, and it's a really clever system. And you can store favorite settings and even name reels and things you could never do with an A80 remote. Now, some of the tools and service aids, if anybody is crazy enough like me to contemplate this kind of restoration conversion work, some of the things you'll need this either in hard copy, the manual, which is fabulous, which is also available in PDF, by the way. I think Philip's reel-to-reel site has that. You need the service manual and the service instructions, service information, SIs they're called, for various improvements and modifications. You'll need these things, which I first saw from Bruno in '75 in Vancouver. These are the PB hex drivers for 2.5 and 3 millimeter, plus other socket drivers, circlip tools, tendilometers, spring scales are really, really handy. You need to check the forces for the brake bands, differential brake forces and things. Lubricant, Studer recommends. Cleaners, degreasers, usual stuff. Peter Money's Nagravox cap kits saved me a lot of time. Otherwise, I would have had to go through all the manual, look up all the parts, order them from the component suppliers and so forth. And that's a great time saver in their 105-degree, very high quality caps. So thank you, Peter. Desoldering, soldering tools, scope, probes, DMM, counter, LC meter, extender cards, very handy, demagnetizer, MRL calibration tapes, some kind of analyzer. I couldn't afford an audio precision, so I have Lindos LA100 fully restored, upgraded, and calibrated by Lindos UK. And a shout out to Philip. Here's reel2reel.nl/Studer/public, and you can FTP the archive of Studer documentation, which is really a valuable resource. So thank you for that. Here's some actual results of the work at -10 VU at 15 inches per second, channel 1 and 2, left and right on the 2-track, 1K reference, and -6, pretty close, good to 20K. And then the 8-track for tracks 1 and 2 of 8, tracked very closely together. So I'm very happy with the response. Now, MRL tapes, they're available, and Chuck Boys is very helpful. If you want to buy some MRLs, here's the 4 that I bought, some for myself and some for MONA. The 50 nips tapes we chose together with MONA 355 nanoweber per meter flux level, or fluxivity as it's called. And the ATR master tapes on the right, the blank tapes, can handle that level very well. I didn't have any issue with the alignment. These are the tape part numbers if you're thinking of ordering, and Betty Spitz is very helpful to supply your master tape needs. These MRLs, by the way, were recorded on ATR tape, original ATR stock. So now, where have these machines gone? They've found a new home at MONA. And the genesis of this project, I guess, was my brother-in-law's Red 17 console that was originally in Abbey Road. It did location recordings in the UK and around Europe because it was quite portable relative to other consoles of the day. It's an 8-channel 2-bus console. EQ, faders, metering, all the essential elements that you find in every modern mixing console. In fact, it's considered the prototype mixing console. Very rare. There's only 4 in the world that we know of. One's at Abbey Road, one's at MONA. That console was also used in Abbey Road in the transfer studio, and saw service with Beatles recordings and other things. You can read about it on the MONA site. I won't go through the gear list at MONA. You can read it for yourself, and you can also check it out at the fryingpan.mona.net.au website. It's very comprehensive. I just mentioned the 2 Studer machines as part of the complement of gear. You can see the 8-track to the far left of the control room, and just cut off is the half-inch 2-track. They're now in service. You can see the ABC News release, or the story about the MONA launch, and also there's a YouTube clip of the 7 p.m. ABC News TV broadcast. So what next? Well, there's another one. Can't help it. There's a Mark II 1/4-inch 2-track, which it turns out I purchased that machine back in the 80s when I was at EMI. And I numbered it number 16. You can see the 6 there, just down below on the back panel. 16 of 17. It was sold out of 301, I guess, and it went to other places in Sydney. My business partner in the digital migration business in Sydney, wound up buying it, and I've purchased it from him. So this is my next restoration project. Brett kindly agreed to sell his 1/4-inch 2-track to me, and I'll be upgrading it to Mark IV with this stuff that's mentioned here. It also already has this special low cap repro head cable if I ever want to upconvert it to 1/2-inch 2-track. So this is a 2023 and onward project in a term which is undefined here called retirement. In the photo, there's myself, Greg Cameron, who was in my team at 301. He's got his business called Amandala Music Technologies in Sydney. Christo Curtis in Sydney, Utopia Audio. Christo was one of our staff engineers at 301 as well in the EMI days. I want to say special thank you to my dear wife, Ann Hudson, who's here in the room, for her support and patience over the years with my crazy project. She's been very patient. To brother-in-law Dave Roper and sister-in-law Barbara Martin, Ann's sister, for the whole EMI Red 17 impetus, which led to the 8-track going to MONA and the 2-track going to MONA. And a shout out to Lucas Glickman in Montreal of Verville Audio, who restored the Red 17 at MONA. And he provided a custom sidecar console and other gear, interface gear for the Red. And of course, to David Walsh, owner of MONA, Brian Ritchie, Chris Townend, Tim Kling on the call, Barry Young on this call, and all the team at Frying Pan and MONA. To the AES Melbourne Section Committee colleagues and section members, everybody in this presentation, suppliers, Daron Kippen of the 1-inch 8-track, Greg Cameron of the 1/2-inch 2-track, and Brett Crossley for the 1/4-inch 2-track. And my team at 301, we called themselves the Spadgers in the Monty Python film. The best team I could have hoped to had the pleasure of working with in the 70s and 80s. And I'm not going to read all these out, but so many people helped me with parts, from the post office locally to Athan pinch rollers, John Bailey, and so on, the precision gauge guys, Marcel Catani in Switzerland, Stephen Crane, tech director 301, John French and Cookie, Kali, Ufe, Jay McKnight, MRL, Peter Money, Nagravox on the call, component suppliers, the enclosure systems who did the powder coating, bearings from Greg Appear, Alistair's on the call, and so on, Betty, ATR, Tech Trading, Peter Tomasini, a guru of metal shaping. And for their advice, in addition to the above, got Brett, Roger Ginsley of TechX in Ontario, Lucas Glickman, I've mentioned, Paul Gold, Salt Mastering, and Gordon New, who put me onto the gauge manufacturer, like John Schell, Alistair, Fred Towell, Gunther Wagner, who couldn't join the call. He sends his apologies. Dan Zellman, so many others. And finally, the end of my slides, but a new beginning for two Studer A80s that have been lovingly restored, and I hope they will produce many decades of fine music in that fabulous new studio. End of slide.
Wow.
Thank you for your attention, and no snoring. No, everybody's okay.
David, what an amazing journey. What an amazing journey.
I must be crazy.
It really is a world cooperation project, and you've led it from Mornington here in Victoria as the genuine Dave project.
Oh golly, I didn't anticipate it would be as involved as it became. But once you get into it, you can't go back.
And
especially if you've committed. If you've committed to a customer, you have to deliver.
There's got to be questions from the gang. If you've got your chat
far away,
or if you want to unmute, as long as it doesn't get overwhelming, can we take any comments or questions from the group now, please?
I found it absolutely fascinating. It's Rodney.
Thank you.
It's a great project that you've done, and you've done a marvelous job on it. And the information about how you put it all together is absolutely worth putting on our website.
Thank you, Rodney. That's very high praise. Thank you. I went to this detail. I'm sort of a guy who gets into this kind of detail, and I apologize for some of it that's maybe too dense and verbose, but I also did it for posterity, for the future, as a reference point, to accompany the machines. Nothing lasts forever, not even the machines, but they'll probably outlast me. And I just thought, well, let's get this down and let's give credit where credit's due. And if anybody's got a layback machine and they're thinking of converting it, there's one that's been done. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's doable. So I just thought the documentation would be useful. I haven't mentioned this, but I've got Excel spreadsheets that your eyes will glaze over, believe me. A couple of hundred lines of technical log from acquisition to delivery, and everything I did to the machine by date, by detail. So, and the parts acquired, prices, where they came from, yada, yada, and all kinds of other tech details that I've provided to MONA as part of the ephemera, that goes with the museum item. So you can see the machine and also the, all of the information that surrounds it.
Please don't apologize for the detail. It's absolutely essential and fantastic. Thank you.
Graham Dicker, did you get that question from Graham on the chat?
I see Graham Dicker. Oh, fantastic. Restored an ATR 800, half-inch 4-track, all up 1,100 hours. So, Graham, I haven't yet, I didn't keep a log of my time. I kept a log of what I did, but it's certainly not commercially viable. I mean, you'd never do this if you want to make money. You do it for the love, really. And, I think of, when I was a kid, I used to ride the steam locomotive in the shunting yard in the docks in New Westminster in Canada, and I have this passion for steam, and I think of myself as like these guys who restore steam locomotives, today, and they do it for the love, and they just do it, and they donate their time. So in a way, I guess this project was like that. It's like a steam locomotive. You just have to see the machine run again and put it back on the tracks and make people smile. So I think I'd say 1,000 hours, maybe. I'd say maybe more across the two machines.
So 4 times that, David.
Maybe it's been, I mean, it's been 6 years and 4 years. So,
1,200 hours a year, that's 7,200.
But some years nothing happened. So I don't know. One day I've diarized everything. I mean, I could add it. I just have to go back through Outlook and add up the hours. And life's too short.
Just catch Graham if he's there. There might be a talk in that too at some stage.
Could be. You can Wikipedia search. Okay, red hens at Blackwood. Okay. Oh, good. Train restoration. Fantastic.
Train restoration as well.
A good friend here is on the Puffing Billy Railway Preservation Society board, and we enjoy this steam train in the Dandenong Mountains in Melbourne called Puffing Billy. You can look it up.
That's good. You'd be able
Michael Portillo liked it anyway. He had his feet hanging out the carriage.
Yeah, with his coloured outfits he wears.
Here
You'd be
we
able
go.
to help me very easily with the Bayer A66 and A77 restorations in your sleep, I'd reckon, after that. All right, more questions, comments, observations?
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Hi, Juice.
Hi. Yeah. This is all fascinating, kind of taking me down a rabbit hole because I got an old Studer A80 VU Mark. I think it's a Mark III, though it actually says Mark II on the back, but the heads look a little different. And I'm just wondering, for restoring an old machine, did you ever have a chance to, like, when you got these machines, did you ever turn it on before you did all this restoration, or did you just do all the recapping and everything and then see what happens after that?
Yeah, it was tempting. A good question. Two things. I'll make 2 comments. One is, the rule of thumb, of course, when you're powering up vintage gear that's been dormant for a while, is get out the variable transformer, the variac, and just bring it up slow, get the electrolytics charged slowly and so on. But with an A80, there's actually a low voltage detection protection circuit, and that doesn't work as well. And I was turning the variac up, nothing's happening. And then when it reaches a certain threshold voltage, boom, on it comes. It's on or off. So hint for people doing variacs and A80s. Secondly, I guess what I did was I restrained myself from smoke and sparks by just turning it on. It was tempting. That turn on didn't happen till just late last year, after full capping, recharge caps, motor caps, logic cards recapped, audio. Let's see, I think I might have got the transport going separately, and then the audio, because there's quite a few caps to do in the audio side of things, especially Mark IV. But no, I restrained from turning on the power. My A810 blew the X2, EMI suppression cap, and bang, smoke, spark. It's the usual thing with Revox, A77, B77, the Studer family. Those caps are usually the first ones to explode because they're across the mains.
Of course. Knowing Studer, they probably had an instruction for turning on their vintage recorders.
Haven't seen that
direction there somewhere in the document.
In the Nagravox cap kits, the replacement X2 caps to replace those reefers that generally explode sooner or later.
They weren't self-healing, were they?
Not self-healing, self-destructing.
Other questions?
But Jude, if you want to reach out through maybe the committee website, I don't want to publish my email address or anything, but there's a contact page. You can reach out if you have questions. I'd be happy to help you.
And Greg Siegel, you had a comment there in chat.
Well, I can
failures?
Voice it if you like. No, look, I was just fascinated by that 2-track super analog format, David. Did Studer ever actually produce machines in that format?
No. Good question. That format seemed to evolve more recently. and I don't know the full history of super analog 1-inch 2-track. If you visit JRF Magnetics website, John French's website, he describes that format and the flux magnetics heads and so forth that he can provide for people who would like to convert their machine to 1-inch 2-track. He can provide the heads.
Right, which answers my second question, where would you get the heads, right?
Yeah, JRF is source that I know of. There may be other sources, but John's site has pictures and descriptions, and they've actually done in New York a pre-listened version of 1-inch 2-track for lacquer mastering for LP production. So where it has the pre-listen head as well as the program head, pre-listen to control the lathe pitch, program to drive the cutter head. And there is, so somewhere in New York, a mastering facility whose name I've forgotten is a 1-inch 2-track machine.
We've got a question on the voice of experience here from Peter Smurden.
Negative. No.
The question was, when you finally powered them up, were there any failures?
No failures. No.
No,
They were well behaved. So I was, when you're recapping, polarity, of course, is critical. And I was triple checking every cap, plus and minus. It's easy to just sort of get into a stupor and to put it in the wrong way, but they're all in the right way. And no tracks were damaged. Thank God. The desoldering went well. There's some tricky things with some very narrow pads and tracks, but and there are some boards which only take axial. There's a counter board where radial doesn't fit. You can't even put it down sideways or anything. It won't. You need an axial. So axial caps were getting hard to get. I think they're getting easier now, but Peter's kits have them all. And there were no failures. No, it was a good experience, actually. Thank God.
Well done. Good. More questions, more comments?
No. For anyone who's, as probably most of us are, I happened to stumble on a new book in a bookshop recently. David, you've probably got it. Abbey Road by David Hepworth. Have you seen it?
David Hepworth. I've got some Abbey Road books.
This is brand new.
Oh, no. Okay, I'll have a look. Thank you.
There it is. So,
okay, right.
For anyone who, and it's the whole history of the place. It's not just recent.
Oh, fabulous.
Well
$55 US in good bookshops. Sorry, not 55 US, 55 Australian dollars in good bookshops, and probably online as well.
Fantastic. Oh, thank you for. I'll get that.
For the AES committee, I've actually sent an email out to everyone with that on it, so you don't need to write it down, David.
Thank you very much.
It's good to see Pat Swallow.
There's my Abbey Road, Brian Southall, and that one Ken Townsend gave to me when I visited.
Oh,
there you go.
Yet another collector's item.
There you go. Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. I used to visit Abbey Road quite a few times. We had a lot of technical collaboration in the EMI Studios worldwide. So EMI Electrola, Toshiba EMI, Tokyo, South Africa, New Zealand, Capital, LA, I visited quite often. They were part of the family. Hollywood and Vine. It was a great time. And I must look up that Abbey Road new book.
Well,
were you at 301 in the TG 12345, Graham Dicker? Graham, yes. So when I arrived in July 78, both TG 12345 were in service in Studio A and Studio B with 16-track Mark 1s each. JBL speakers, Richard Lush and Martin Benge and those guys were engineers then. Christo, number of guys there we worked with. And the Neves were in a storeroom waiting to be installed to replace the TGs. By the way, we also had 3 or 4 TG12410 transfer consoles for disc mastering and cassette mastering. So there were three of those in service. Gorgeous consoles. So the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there were a lot of tears shed when they went, and I had the job of finding new owners for the TG1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and the Mark 1 16 tracks. We sold the pair, console plus recorder, for 10,000. One went to Color Film Artarman, and the other, I think, maybe Phil Punch. Anyway, too long ago. Apologies, Phil, if you're on this video. So yeah, TG1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The guys, they like the Neve, but they missed some features and sound of the TG. And of course, now they're worth a fortune. Harry, Dolby HX. Okay, so it's not NRS. It's Dolby HX. Is a bias modulation technology that came out of Bang & Olufsen, I believe, Denmark, and it rather than a noise reduction, Dolby developed HX Pro headroom extension. It provides 2 to 3 dB more headroom by monitoring the high frequency content of the program signal being recorded. And there is a phenomenon called self-bias, where the HF content in the program actually adds to the bias amplitude, which should remain constant otherwise. So what HX Pro does is it reduces the machine's bias level by the amount of self-bias in the program signal dynamically, in order to maintain a target value of constant bias. And that prevents over-biasing, and that actually improves headroom. So that's the whole concept behind HX Pro. I actually got a few modules here that I'll be putting into the 1/4-inch 2-track to see how it goes. There's optional plugins for the Mark IV power stage record driver card in the audio channel, where you can add the Dolby HX Pro feature. We at 301 though, we did launch Dolby spectral recording to Australia, SR, and the guys came out from Dolby and industry came and everything. And the program was Booker T, Green Onions, Booker T and the MG. That's right. They brought a tape out, master tape. Tony Spath and the guys at Dolby. So we had a lot of fun. But now that's a good question. So Revox 270 and 807 feature it as a switchable option. I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with either of the Revox C270 or 807 on HX Pro. Possibly Studer did include that as a feature.
Yes,
but it also could be referring to an NRS, Dolby NRS on those machines. I'm not sure.
I have an 807, and I'm pretty sure it does have HX Pro, and I'll also confess that I've never even tried it.
Okay. Well, that's the whole concept.
I should. So.
All that classical music.
Yeah. Great questions. Great questions. Fantastic.
Okay, now's your last chance to well, not the last chance, but now you can ask David what you want, or any other comments. Okay, well, we'll probably end the formal part of the evening, and I'm going to do that by saying, can everybody unmute their muting? And I would really like to thank David for a lot of work put in. I don't think you did this restoration just so you could present it to us, but it certainly feels like it. No, it's okay. I don't need it. It's okay. So I really do thank you for the time and effort in the presentation, as well as the time and effort in an amazing task. Well done. And we've all now got to go down to Tasmania and visit MONA, even the people in America.
Yeah, even I have to.
Okay, so can you all please thank David for a wonderful session this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored.